Hi, I'm Leigha, and I'm a product manager for Flutter here at Google. I work on Flutter for iOS, so was happy to see some iOS developers and Flutter for design. So I was just in Nairobi at Flutter Forward, met with a lot of great Flutter developers, and we wanted to travel to other places and kind of summarize the event and some of the announcements and make it more interactive. So I will kind of go through a summary of some of the announcements, but I hope that you all ask questions and we can make it more of a discussion. So for those who are new to Flutter, one thing that we usually talk about when we discuss Flutter is these pillars, and it really guides every product decision that we make. So it's keeping Flutter beautiful, and this means that we want to make sure app developers can control every pixel on the screen and really create these beautiful and unique digital experiences. Fast, and this has to do with Dart compiling directly to machine code so that your apps are really fast. You're not going through an interpreter like other cross-platform frameworks. And productive, this means we want to create tooling to help all developers move really fast. And portable, this has to do with all the different devices and architectures that we support. And of course, open. So the fact that Flutter and Dart are both open source, you can inspect every single line in the framework, you can fork it, you can propose changes. So that all helps you understand what's happening, so it's not just this big black box. So if you watched the keynote, you saw Tim kind of talk about these stats, which are really exciting, right? Flutter was launched maybe 5 years ago in 2017, and since then we've had 5 million developers and 700,000 apps launched into the app stores, which is amazing. And Flutter is the #3 open source project on GitHub in terms of number of contributors, which is really awesome. So if you haven't contributed to Flutter yet, I highly recommend that you go in and maybe try to fix a bug or add something. I opened up my first pull request on the plugin repo yesterday, so I was like, I'm making progress. And at the event, we talked about Flutter 3.7, which is our latest stable release. So we kind of quickly talked about some of the product updates because we wanted it to focus more on the vision of where we're going in the future. But just to summarize a few, we've made a ton of enhancements to Material 3 support. What we're showing here is this cool little demo app, which is publicly available. You can see all the different components, play with them, change their color and state to kind of see how they look before adding them into your app. And personally, I'm an iOS person, so I'm always a little skeptical of Material, right? But this looks really beautiful, and it really brings a more modern touch to the Material design system. We also announced adaptive layout, which just ensures that your apps are going to look great on different screen sizes with pretty minimal effort from you, so definitely a time saver. And menu bars and cascading menus. So these can be customized, or you can have them look more like the default system menus on our desktop platforms, like for example, Windows. And the thing that I'm most excited about, because again, iOS, is Impeller, which is a complete overhaul of our rendering engine. And we've really focused on trying to increase performance. So Impeller is available on preview for iOS. Right now you can build your apps with a Impeller flag when you're building for iOS, but in the next release we're planning to make that the default so long as all the feedback is good. So definitely, if you haven't tested Impeller already, highly recommend you start playing with it and file any issues that you come across. The next one, iOS release validation. Anyone who's released an iOS app to the App Store knows that there are like a million things that you need to do to get it approved, right? So we've added a lot of those validations directly into the Flutter build IPA command. So this way you know right away you're missing an icon or you didn't increment the version number, all that good stuff. And we've made a lot of updates to dev tools, specifically things around like memory analysis, and the UI looks much nicer. It's kind of easier to navigate, so definitely check that out. So that was just a couple of things, right? But there are just a bajillion different GitHub commits that were incorporated into this really huge release. I'm not going to talk about any more of the features, but For all of our stable releases, we have this great blog that goes out from our technical program management team where they give highlights of all the latest releases. And you can even go into the direct release notes and see all the different commits and the code and the messages. So definitely check it out. Okay, so in the spirit of Flutter Forward, we're not going to spend too much time talking about the current release. Instead, we'll talk about some of the announcements that we made for the vision looking forward, aptly named. So we focus on a couple of different themes, and these are similar to the pillars that I talked about before. They kind of align nicely with them. But these are the themes that all these new features that we're working on kind of slot into. So first is breakthrough graphics performance. This is things like impeller that we just talked about, or we announced pixel shaders for both web and mobile, which allows you to make like really crazy, cool, unique graphics. We're also focused on more seamless integration for both web and mobile. I know being a mobile developer, I'm really excited about it. One of the issues of using a cross-platform framework is you have to worry about communicating with those native APIs. So we talked about 2 tools that we're working on that help auto-generate bindings to make those API calls. So you're working directly in Dart instead of needing to like write some code on the native side and some code on the Dart side, which is really exciting. We also talked about different emerging architectures that we're targeting. risc-v, which I don't know that much about, to be honest, but the demo was really cool. And also WebAssembly, which will really help increase performance and do new things with drawing directly to the canvas on web apps. And of course, we're continuing to focus on our developer experience. 2 things that I'm excited about there are our vertical toolkits. So we already have the gaming vertical toolkit, and at Flutter Forward we talked about the general availability of the news toolkit for creating news apps or any media apps really. So let's go into some of the specifics. One thing that was more recently announced was a preview for Dart's new major release, which is Dart 3. So you can now jump in and start testing some of these features, playing around, provide feedback. And there are a couple of different things that we talked about when it came to Dart 3 Alpha. The first one is records and patterns. So this is just some new features inside of the Dart language that will make your life easier when it comes to writing code. So I'll give an example. This is a Dart 2 function, right? So if you want to return latitude and longitude, you're kind of forced to put it in this list. And then when you want to grab each one of those values, you have to just use positional indexes, so the 0 and the 1 to grab each one, but that's pretty prone to error, right? And it's a tad verbose because you need a couple of different lines. So in Dart 3, or I guess in Dart 2 as well, if you wanted to avoid those positional indexes, you have to kind of create your own class, right? So I would create my own location class, and then I can grab both of those latitude and longitude attributes. But no one wants to be creating all tons of classes when it's just pretty simple things like this, right? So now in Dart 3 with records and patterns, we're able to return the individual values, and we can still grab them from positional indexes. Like here I have the $1, $2, which isn't great, but we can control the 2 different data types. So right now these are both doubles, but I can control the individual data types. So that's a plus, but still positional indexes, not great. So with the patterns, we're able to just specify the names that we want to grab. So we could just say latitude and longitude, and again, we have those different data types. So it makes your code way cleaner and avoids any problems with manually specifying the index numbers. So aside from just the Flutter Forward keynote, we have a ton of different breakout sessions, and a lot of them are from the engineers who built this feature. So when it comes to records and patterns, Bob, who's the lead engineer for this, created a video that talks all about their approach and what the path forward is. So if you're interested, definitely check it out. Okay, so we also talked about how one of our themes is developer experience. And if you've been using Dart over the past couple of years, you've heard about null safety, right? It's been a big topic of conversation. It's been a lot of work to migrate existing Dart code into null safety, but with this release, we're really targeting 100% null safety, which is great. I won't go into too much of the details about what null safety is, but it has a couple benefits for Dart developers, namely avoiding issues with accidentally returning a null value when you're not supposed to. But what gives us the confidence to start moving towards 100% null safety now is that 98% of, I think, the top 1,000 packages on pub.dev are already null safe. So everyone's already seems to be bought into null safety and is migrating their code. So now it seems natural to kind of turn this feature on. You'll no longer be able to work in, null safety mode on or off. Everything will require null safety. And aside from just preventing errors, there's also the performance benefits. So the compiler now doesn't have to worry about null safety issues. And just to kind of give you an idea of how drastically that improves performance is if we look at the machine code, I can't remember the exact number of instructions. This is maybe like 30 or something like that. That was back in Dart 1. As we started to move towards more null safety in Dart 2, we reduced that to just, maybe 10 different commands. And then as we move to Dart 3, this will be reduced to just 3 commands. So it's really making a huge performance difference. So that was developer experience in Dart. That was new language features. I also mentioned new emerging devices. So Dart already is pretty portable, right? We have support for compiling to all these different platforms and architectures. And now in Dart 3, we're adding 2 new architectures. So that's risc-v, which is this emerging, totally open source architecture. And Michael on my team gave a really cool demo at the Flutter Forward keynote where he showed it on this risc-v device that he literally built in the hotel the night before. I watched him do it. And also WebAssembly, which I briefly mentioned before, which really has to do with building web apps with Flutter. So this is what the risc-v demo looked like. If you're interested, definitely watch the keynote or try it out for yourself. Cool, so now let's talk about Flutter for Web. So we've been working really hard on Flutter for Web. A lot of people have given feedback about performance, and we've really focused on trying to optimize Flutter web apps to make them more performant across the board. Time to load, experiences in the app itself. So we've done things like made canvas kit reductions. There were a lot of issues that came up about different font size or font rendering. So we've reduced the size of rendering fonts, deferred loading, improved concurrency. And I don't think I have the chart in this presentation, but Tim at the keynote showed this really interesting chart that showed like a 40% decrease in time to load when it came to the latest changes that are not even on our master branch. It's like a master branch plus all these specific flags turned on in Chrome, like really cutting edge stuff. And we're working closely with other teams at Google, like Chrome, to make sure that we're making this a performant experience. And part of this is compiling Dart directly to WebAssembly. And Tim in the keynote really made some funny comments like, that we live in this world that's built on top of the internet, and it's all based on top of this protocol for sending hypertext. But when we talk about Flutter apps, that's really not what we're targeting. We're not targeting the DOM. We're not creating static websites. We're really talking about creating web apps that bring all the things that Flutter is great at to life, like custom graphics, beautiful animations. So we're really focusing on these new architectures that better support drawing directly to the canvas on web, as opposed to that DOM architecture. So Tim showed, how a quick demo of just compiling to WebAssembly and showing that Flutter web app running in the browser, which is really cool. Okay, and I think this was personally my favorite part of web. I think if you've used Flutter for mobile, you may have used the add to app feature, right? Some people have existing native apps, and when you talk about migrating to Flutter, rewriting your entire app is a lot of work. So we have these features both on Android and iOS to embed a Flutter app directly in your native app already. So you can gradually start migrating or just have one feature that's built in Flutter to start. So this is basically add to app for web, right? We're actually embedding a Flutter app in an HTML page. And this has a lot of benefits, if you already have an HTML page set up and you want to start building features in Flutter or test it out. But when I was talking to some folks at afterwards, someone also mentioned SEO is a really highly requested feature, right? But now kind of with this element embedding, you can almost allow like the parts of your app that are really supposed to be targeted towards SEO, like page titles and descriptions, can kind of be in HTML. And you can have the Flutter bit being the part that Flutter does really well, like the graphics and animations, which is super cool. I highly recommend going and watching this demo because it was very exciting. We showed embedding the Flutter app, which in this case is this counter app that you can see in the device frame. But what's really cool is this isn't just an iframe. Iframes are kind of this black box. It's hard to pass data forwards and backwards. But Tim's demo showed how it's really easy to pass the state. So we have, can you see? Yeah. So we had like the state down here, and you can increment the state from the HTML side, or you can increment the state from the Flutter side. You can have this as just a standard div, or you can actually apply CSS transformations onto that div. So this div is basically just distorted to match the device frame, but this outer piece is an image, like an HTML image tag. And you can apply all different CSS styling to it, like we showed this CSS mirror effect. And it's all still a live app, which is just super cool. It really has like endless possibilities. And this demo is available in our GitHub repository. It's open source. I've seen people playing around with it. It's in the experimentals folder in samples. And I've even saw like on Twitter this morning, someone built their own demo of element embedding already, and it was awesome. So really cool stuff. Okay, and what I mentioned this before, impeller is great for graphics performance, but pixel shaders, which are basically just these equations that run directly on your GPU, make these crazy calculations for what color a pixel should be. So it allows you to do these like really crazy effects without slowing down your app too much because it's directly targeting the GPU. So pixel shaders people are playing around with them on web. I've seen a lot of people playing with them on mobile. It's been really cool to just see the crazy stuff people are doing. And we show a pretty brief example of this in one of the tech talks. So this tech talk was really targeted towards designers and helping them just start building a prototype with Flutter. And we briefly touch on fragment shaders, and we also touch on things like variable fonts or just basic like material and Cupertino widgets to help develop or help designers get started. Okay, so that was Flutter for web, and now I'll talk about Flutter for mobile. So I mentioned briefly before the Flutter News toolkit. I myself have been playing around with it. It's super cool. It basically allows you to easily customize this template news app. So I think we said that some of the early adopters had reduced their development time by like 80% when it came to developing a news app. It's templatized, so it's meant to be customized with things like adding your own logo, your own branding, font sizes, and it's all built on top of Firebase too. So it has things like ad integrations, notifications, profiles and subscriptions, authentication, all this stuff that is really annoying to build. Plus it looks great already. So we've already have some publishers that are using it. We showed a video that featured a couple publishers in the Eastern African area and also Morocco. So it's cool to see people already benefiting from this. And one thing that I personally worked on, which I will talk to anyone about, is the Wondrous app. And if you haven't seen Wondrous already, it's available on the Android Play Store and the Apple App Store. On iOS, it uses Impeller, so it's a great demo of how nice Impeller looks. It feels really smooth. But we built Impeller, or we built Wondrous to just be a reference app for Flutter to show demonstrations of how you can build like a real complete app that looks beautiful. It has these custom graphics and like really stunning animations. So anytime I'm talking to someone who's like skeptical about Flutter's performance or the design aspect, I just pull up Wondrous on my phone and start swiping through. And we just launched the next version of Wondrous, which aside from just targeting normal smartphones, now has support for tablets and foldable devices. So all the code is open source. It was built by the team at Skinner, and they've written a bunch of blogs that talk directly about how they created the animations, how they created the adaptive widgets for different screen sizes, the role that designers played, performance, accessibility. So it's really meant to just show best practices of Flutter across the board. And of course, it's all open source, so people are welcome to contribute to it and open up pull requests, fork it, make changes to it. Highly recommend testing it out or checking out the blogs on Skinner. And this was personally one of the things that I was most excited about. Like I mentioned before, when it comes to creating mobile apps with Flutter, you often need to talk to native APIs, probably more than one in your app, right? Maybe you want to access the camera, the file system, you want to send your users a notification. So right now, this is all done through method channels, usually in plugins. Method channels are great, but it requires a decent amount of code. Right, you're writing all the platform-specific code. You have to handle lots of different cases. You have this Dart platform interface that kind of bridges between all of the different platform-specific code. So when these native APIs change, when Apple introduces a new API or Android introduces a new API, it's a decent amount of effort to adapt those method channels. So we've been working on two tools. They're called FFI Gen and JNI Gen. So FFI is for wrapping around C-based APIs. So that includes Objective-C and Swift. And JNI is for Java-based APIs. So that's on Android, that's Java, and also Kotlin. So what these packages do is you set up a configuration file and you basically specify like the classes, or you can also specify the methods within those classes that you essentially want to wrap and call them inside of your Dart code. And then based on that config file, the tool will auto-generate all the bindings. So those do things like handle different data types, do all the messy stuff with pointers that you don't want to worry about. So it really makes it a lot easier to start calling those APIs directly from Dart. Now, I will say that these are both extremely experimental, like making changes like in the minutes leading up to the Flutter Forward keynote. I worked on the demo for FFI Gen and I had to write a bit of Objective-C code to get everything working and handle callbacks. But if you pay attention to the design docs that our engineering team all makes public, you'll see that there's a lot of work, there's a lot of discussion. We're really hoping to make this, the tooling for this really good, so that you have to worry much less about method channels and what if APIs change and everything like that. So the demo, at the keynote, I showed this demo that wrapped around the Health Connect API on Android and the Core Motion framework on iOS to get your number of steps that day. So all that code for that app is on the samples repo as well. And we also have this code lab, which is using FFI in a Flutter plugin. So this is more generally just around C APIs, but if you want to specifically see code that wraps around Apple's APIs and Android's APIs, you can check out the pedometer repo. Okay, and then Impeller. So this was a really cool quick demo that we showed just to really make it clear how big of a difference Impeller is making when it comes to performance. At its core, when we built Impeller, we were really just trying to get rid of shader compilation jank. We see people on GitHub filing issues, screen recordings of their app where it would jump a little, especially when you first load and you were waiting to have the shaders warm up. So that's what we were really targeting, is getting rid of that. But we saw as a result that in some of these edge cases that are really graphically intensive, that impeller was just making a huge difference. So one of those was SVG clipping. So on the left-hand side is an iOS build that is using Skia, which is our current default renderer. And as you scroll down, you can see just like, it's kind of hard to see when you're when you're losing frames from projecting, but it's like dropping a lot of frames, and on the dev tools chart, it's hovering at about like 6 or I think 7 to 10 frames per second. But impeller on the right-hand side was up to 60 frames per second. So like really big difference. And I scrolled through this app on my phone directly, and you can really feel the difference. It's super exciting. So like I said, impeller, you can use it behind this flag. Impeller, it's been in preview for a bit, but we didn't feel like we had enough testers on it yet. So we need people to go in and play with it and file issues and let us know if there are problems with it. But one of the really cool parts of the keynote was we talked about how impeller just enables brand new use cases. So we're actually playing around with impeller support for 3D, which is really cool. So this will support 3D widgets that are painted entirely in Flutter. And I gave a demo of this where we made this 3D dash. And the way it works is you just specify a GLB file. And a GLB file is just a way to express 3D data. So you can build it in tools like Blender, which is open source. So you can create these 3D models, you can edit them, save them, and then you just feed that GLB file directly into Flutter, and Flutter will paint the 3D widget, which is really exciting. So right now, we haven't made the code for this demo public yet because we're getting some insiders to test the API design, and once we kind of have a direction on the API design, we'll probably add it behind a flag and send out an announcement for people to play with the sample code or build their own demos. So super exciting. And we have a lot of really smart engineers working on impeller. In case you didn't know, graphics, rendering, a lot of crazy math involved. So if you want to learn more about the details of how impeller works and the use cases we're targeting, Chinmay, who's one of the lead engineers, gave a really good talk that, again, is listed on all the Flutter Forward content. And then I just want to mention a couple of previews that we didn't talk about in the Flutter keynote, but we have videos up on the Flutter Forward website for. We have a preview for 2D scrolling, which is super exciting. Kate, who's the engineer who worked on that, gave a really great talk. We have some videos on multiple window support for desktop, which is super exciting. And one thing I didn't put on here, but because I'm the iOS person, I'm really excited about, is we recently just merged a pull request for wireless debugging on iOS, which I think was like the #2 requested Flutter feature of all time or something like that. So really exciting. Just to like quickly summarize, we have breakthrough graphics, which is impeller, shaders, and this new awesome 3D support we're working on. Seamless integration, so making it easier to add Flutter to an existing web app or call native APIs on mobile. These new architectures like WebAssembly and risc-v. And also things like sound null safety, our new language features with records and patterns, and the Google News Toolkit, and Wonderist, which is, again, completely open source. So exciting stuff. I hope that if you haven't watched all the demos already, you go back and watch them or play with the code. There's a whole list of different tech talks. I think there were also some recordings of like quick tips from some of the developers that were there. Really exciting stuff. So thanks, and I'm happy to take questions or anything.